My father pointed a trembling finger at my chest, his face purple with rage, and screamed that he was going to have me arrested for kidnapping and raising my own little sister behind his back. He leaned in close, his voice dripping with venom, and snarled, "Because you're just their sister. Know your place." I didn't cry. I didn't scream or shrink back. I just looked him dead in the eye and smiled, because he had no idea that I legally owned the very roof over his head, and his time was entirely up. That was almost a year ago. Yesterday, my father broke down sobbing in mandatory family therapy, completely destroyed. When the clinic doctor calmly looked at him and asked him to name my little sister Katie's absolute best friend, my father froze, choking on his own guilt as the final, devastating truth of his failure came crashing down on him. My name is Clara Vance, and at 31 years old, I've learned that the people who share your blood are sometimes the absolute last ones who actually care if you survive. Growing up, our household operated under a very specific, suffocating rulebook. My younger sister, Katie, and I were raised by parents who viewed children not as human beings to be nurtured, but as decorative accessories for their high society portfolio. My father was a senior corporate executive whose entire identity was wrapped up in country club memberships and flashy charity galas, while my mother spent her days curating an illusion of perfection that crumbled the second you looked beneath the surface. When Katie was born, the novelty wore off for them almost immediately. Once they realized raising a child required actual emotional labor, sleepless nights, and unconditional presence, they simply checked out. They outsourced her entire childhood to a rotating door of indifferent nannies, while shifting all the heavy domestic and emotional burdens directly onto my shoulders. I was barely 12 years old when I started packing Katie's lunches, helping her with homework, wiping her tears when she had nightmares, and tucking her into bed because our parents were too busy whining and dining clients across the city. As the years bled into one another, Katie stopped looking at our mother and father for comfort. She looked at me. I was the one who taught her how to ride a bike, celebrated her school milestones, and held her hand through the terrifying adolescent years when she felt completely abandoned by the very people who brought her into the world. My parents lived under the same roof, but to us, they were expensive ghosts. They funded our food and shelter out of a sense of public obligation, but they never gave us a single ounce of genuine warmth. I watched my sister shrink under their cold, critical gaze, constantly terrified that she would never be good enough to earn their affection. When I turned 18 and finally left for university, a piece of my heart stayed behind on that living room floor, knowing Katie was still trapped in that icy mansion alone. I worked 2 jobs through college just to stay afloat, but every single weekend, I drove back home just to check on her, smuggle her away from their toxic environment, and remind her that she was loved. I thought that as I grew older, my parents might finally look at what I had done and feel a shred of gratitude for keeping their family together. I was entirely wrong. They didn't see a devoted sister saving a neglected child. They saw an inconvenient interruption to their lifestyle, completely unaware that the quiet resentment they were building would eventually come back to destroy their entire world. The breaking point finally arrived on a stormy Tuesday evening when Katie, then just 14, called me in absolute hysterics, crying so hard she could barely form coherent sentences. She had accidentally broken an expensive crystal vase in the living room, and our mother had responded with a level of psychological cruelty that crossed every boundary of human decency. Mother didn't just yell. She looked my trembling sister dead in the eyes and told her that she was an unwanted mistake, a financial drain, and that she wished she had never given birth to her. Hearing those words shattered whatever fragile restraint I had left inside me. I didn't hesitate. I drove straight over to my parents' mansion, packed up all of Katie's clothes, school books, and personal belongings into garbage bags right in front of them, and officially took her out of that house to live with me permanently. I enrolled her in a local school near my apartment, managed her medical appointments, and became her legal guardian through a notarized emergency agreement, finally giving her the safe, loving home she deserved. But my parents didn't care about Katie's well-being. They cared about their public image and the fact that their subordinate domestic prop had walked away. Within weeks, my father discovered where we were and marched uninvited up to my apartment door, pounding on the wood until I had no choice but to open it. He pushed his way into my living room without permission, his face distorted with rage, and unleashed a torrent of venomous abuse. He screamed at me for undermining his authority, accused me of stealing his child, and barked that I had better pack Katie's bags right then and there or face immediate police action for abduction. When I stood my ground, reminding him of the emotional abuse and neglect that forced my hand, he stepped right up to my face, his eyes flashing with pure contempt. He pointed a rigid finger at my chest and spat out the exact words that burned themselves permanently into my memory. "You think you're some kind of savior, don't you?" my father snarled, his voice echoing off the walls. "You're nothing. You're just her sister. Know your place, pack her bags, and hand her over right now, or I swear I'll have you arrested before the sun comes up." He truly believed that a simple threat of police intervention and a condescending reminder of my birth order would cause me to crumble into instant submission. He had spent my entire life conditioning me to bow down to his commands, completely blinded by his own arrogance. But standing there in my own home, shielding my terrified little sister who was crying behind my back, I didn't flinch or shed a single tear. I just stared at him with an eerie, unbothered calm that completely threw him off balance, because he had no earthly idea that his arrogant outburst had just walked him straight into a lethal legal trap he could never escape. When my father slammed the apartment door behind him, storming out into the night with empty threats of police retaliation, most people would have panicked. But as a former corporate financial coordinator who spent years auditing complex agreements, panic was a luxury I simply didn't have time for. I turned around, walked over to my desk, and opened my laptop to review the meticulous digital paper trail I had quietly built over the past decade. While my parents were busy drowning themselves in high society debt, lavish galas, and country club dues to maintain a fragile illusion of wealth, they had made a fatal financial oversight. Years prior, when my grandfather passed away, he saw right through my father's reckless spending habits and financial incompetence. Knowing my father would eventually liquidate the family estate to fund his superficial lifestyle, my grandfather set up a heavily protected private trust and transferred the primary deed of their sprawling suburban mansion directly into a secure holding entity under my supervision, conditioned upon specific neglect clauses. Furthermore, because my parents had repeatedly fallen behind on their municipal property taxes and estate maintenance fees over the last 3 years to cover my sister's private school tuition, I had quietly stepped in and paid those massive balances out of my own independent savings, legally locking my name onto the primary property titles as a lien holder and co-trustee. They thought they owned the roof over their heads, but in reality, they were nothing more than tenants at will on a property completely controlled by the daughter they viewed as a disposable nuisance. For months, I played along with their toxic games, keeping my mouth shut and letting them believe they held all the power, while my estate attorney quietly prepared the final eviction notices and asset freezes in the background. I wasn't just protecting Katie from emotional abuse. I was methodically building an impenetrable legal fortress that would completely dismantle their arrogant world the second they crossed the line. Standing in my quiet living room with Katie safely asleep in the next room, I realized that my father's furious threat to have me arrested wasn't a display of strength. It was the desperate gasp of a drowning man who had no idea he was standing on quicksand. The trap was fully set. All the legal documents were airtight, and the countdown to their total public and financial ruin had officially begun. The grand finale arrived on a bright Saturday afternoon, exactly 48 hours after my father's empty threats of police intervention. I dressed in a sharp, tailored blazer, secured Katie safely with a trusted friend, and drove over to my parents' sprawling suburban estate alongside my estate attorney, Mr. Vance. As we pulled into the circular driveway, the place was packed with high society vehicles. My parents were hosting an exclusive garden party for their wealthy country club friends, eager to flaunt their untouchable status. We walked straight through the double front doors into the sunlit atrium where my father and mother were holding court, laughing loudly as they accepted praises from their affluent guests. The moment my father spotted me standing there calmly beside a high-powered attorney, his arrogant smile completely collapsed. He marched right over, his face flushing a furious crimson, and loudly demanded to know what I was doing on his property before I ruined his social standing. I didn't flinch or raise my voice. I simply gestured toward Mr. Vance, who stepped forward with a heavy, professional demeanor and opened a sleek leather portfolio. With absolute clinical precision, my attorney served my father with an official, court-stamped emergency notice of lease termination, property lien foreclosure, and immediate eviction. The document laid out the brutal legal reality for everyone in earshot to hear. My parents didn't own a single square inch of the multi-million-dollar estate they were standing in. They were 3 years behind on their mandatory property maintenance fees, and because they had repeatedly violated the harassment and neglect clauses tied to the trust, their right to reside on the premises was terminated effective immediately. The absolute silence that fell over the crowded room was deafening. Gasps rippled through the gathered guests as my mother dropped her crystal champagne flute, watching it shatter into 1,000 pieces against the marble floor. My father snatched the legal papers from the attorney's hands, his eyes darting frantically across the text, looking for a loophole that simply did not exist. He stammered, his voice cracking with sudden, overwhelming panic, trying to claim this was a malicious prank or an illegal mistake. But Mr. Vance calmly reminded him that every signature on file was legally verified, and they had exactly 24 hours to pack their designer belongings and vacate the premises before local law enforcement was brought in to enforce the lockout. The high society guests didn't wait around to watch the rest of the disaster unfold. They grabbed their bags, whispered behind their hands, and hurriedly rushed out the front doors, completely destroying my parents' precious social reputation in a matter of minutes. My father stood paralyzed in the center of his empty atrium, looking smaller and older than I had ever seen him, finally realizing that the daughter he tried to threaten had legally pulled the rug right out from under his entire empire. Fast forward to the present day, and the contrast between our old lives is nothing short of miraculous. My father, stripped of his multi-million-dollar estate, his country club memberships, and the illusion of his untouchable status, was forced to downsize into a cramped, modest apartment on the far side of town, while my mother had to take a humble retail job just to stay afloat. But the most profound change happened when court-mandated family therapy finally forced them to face the wreckage of their own choices. Yesterday, sitting in that quiet clinical office under the sterile fluorescent lights, my father finally broke down completely, weeping openly as the deep, suffocating weight of his failures crashed down on him. The clinic doctor, a sharp and perceptive woman who had spent weeks peeling back the layers of our family dynamic, calmly leaned forward across her desk, looked my father dead in the eye, and asked him a very simple, direct question to test his genuine awareness. "Can you tell me your daughter Katie's absolute best friend's name?" The room went dead silent. My father froze instantly, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, choking entirely on his own suffocating guilt and shame. He couldn't answer. He didn't even know who my sister spent her days with, because he had never truly looked at her or cared about her existence. He sat there shattered, realizing that his obsession with status had cost him everything that actually mattered. Meanwhile, Katie and I are thriving in a warm, peaceful home filled with genuine laughter, security, and unconditional love, completely free from the toxic shadows of our past. I prove that you don't need a title or permission to protect the people who depend on you. Now, I am deeply curious about all of you listening to my story today. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have held your ground and foreclosed on your own parents? Or would you have let them walk all over you just to keep the peace? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to tell me the city or country you're watching from so I can see just how far our story has reached across the world. Thank you so much for watching until the very end, and I'll see you in the next story.